everyone. Welcome to the East Tennessee Historical Society's program, the showing of the Steven Spielberg Lincoln film, and then the comments that will be made prior to that by Dr. William E. Hardy. But I just want to make a few announcements to begin with. My name is Lisa Oakley, and I'm Curator of Education here at the Historical Society. And we're just really excited about a lot of the things we have coming up, especially next weekend. Some of you have already mentioned to me that you're aware of the History Fair event that will be free and open to the public next Saturday. And we have a lot going on. If you've never attended that, you would really enjoy it, I think, and find something for everyone. We have Crouch Park, as well as this street is closed off for events and reenactors. We have in Crouch Park, we have a living history timeline with reenactors. Over in the extension of Crouch Park that runs up to Gay Street, we have vendors and crafters, and we have historical organizations from all over East Tennessee represented. The museum's open free. We have trolley tours to the different downtown sites. The free trolley tours, as well as admission to those sites during those hours for the trolley tours, is free. We have a lot of other partners in that event. We have, of course, the historic sites and museums that are on the trolley tours, as well as Knott's Heritage, and we have the Civil War Roundtable that will be doing Civil War driving tours, or I should say bus tours. And so all that really kicks off from downtown Knoxville, as well as a number of the businesses downtown. And if you haven't been as well to the downtown farmers market, that will be going full speed as well, and they partner with us during that day. And we have just wonderful things going on in this facility. We have a lot of things that will be posted over the week on our website. You can find our brochures out at the front desk. It's fairly easy though. It's www.easttnhistory.org, and that's the best place to get updates on what we have planned and the time and the schedule, or just check at our information tables both in the lobby here as well as on Crouch Park, and they will have programs that day as well. The best way to find out what we have to offer, and we have a number of things going on, and leading up in context of the Civil War, we are in the sesquicentennial celebration, or I should say commemoration years. And in 2015, we will be hosting the major Tennessee Signature event here in Knoxville. We don't have that date set quite yet, as well as some local events, and we hope a blue-gray reunion and some other things going on. And the best way to find out what we have going on between now and then is we have these little sheets out at the donation box and at the front desk. This is to get on our email newsletter list. And then ultimately the best way to find out what we're doing and to support what we're doing is to become a member of the Historical Society. And you can find those brochures and ask folks at the front desk about doing that today if you would like to. So we just appreciate your support by being here. And we are here today to talk about Lincoln and to talk about the film. And I will be doing an introduction in just a moment of our historian that will be doing that program for us. But I also wanted to talk a little bit about our signature, or our sesquicentennial commemoration event through the Society, or I should say a program, not event. In Death Not Divided, Burial Places of East Tennessee Civil War Soldiers. This is an effort to document the burials across the region, and we even have some incorporated from across the state of Civil War veterans. Or we're trying to locate East Tennesseans that might be buried in other places that served in the Civil War. And so this is kind of a grassroots effort that we're trying to get people involved in across the communities, and to send in information about the burials that they're aware of, to survey cemeteries, to take that documentary information and submit it to us. And we also have a lot of information that we're gathering from other sources, archival sources. And all that's going into a database that is or will be, if it's not yet accessible, on our new website. So when you go to www.easttnhistory.org, you will see a new website, and we are really excited about it. There are a lot of new things that it features, and that database will be a part of that website as we get it ready to roll. It may not be actually introduced to its full extent yet, but that's what we hope to do, is have it available for folks to research and to find their own ancestors or their community's history there. Cheryl Henderson is our director, and she's also the director of that program, and she's here today, and I know she would be glad to answer any questions that you might have about that. But without further ado, we're here today to see a film. And the way this is going to work, just so folks kind of know, we're going to have comments first for about 20-25 minutes. We'll have kind of a program setting the stage and setting the context for what you're going to see, kind of pulling out some pieces of the film to highlight and to explain for you. And then we're going to have a brief intermission from there. I mean, very brief, like 5 minutes, so that we can do some transition of technology here at the front. And then we're going to be watching the film straight out from there to the end of the film. And so if you need to be excused for restroom or whatever, please feel free during the film. Just be conscious of folks around you. But we're going to ask that you go to the rear, just kind of go down the sides of the aisle and go to the rear doors so that the light doesn't interrupt as much. So that's kind of how we'll run things from there. The exhibit also, if you have an opportunity to see our exhibit before October 13th, I can't remember if it's pen and sword and pen. I'm always getting them mixed up. But a Sword and Pen, our East Tennessee and the Civil War exhibit, is an incredible exhibit, and it is up, like I said, until October the 13th. So that will certainly be something if you come next weekend on Saturday to see, or please find an opportunity to come anytime before those wonderful artifacts leave. All right, well, I would like to introduce our speaker for the afternoon. Dr. William E. Hardy is doctoral, not a student anymore, a graduate from the University of Tennessee, History Department, student of Dr. Ash there, and his expertise is on the Reconstruction period of the Civil War story, and has also worked with us during that time here at the East Tennessee Historical Society. Has worked closely with me. We're a two-person education department, and he's been a real asset in working with our teachers and our students, both through our Teaching American History grant program, which he served as the academic facilitator for, as well as through National History Day, which is a wonderful program. We are the district sponsors, co-sponsors with the university, but district coordinators for the National History Day competition program. It's a lot like Science Fair, but for history. And we really enjoy doing that with middle and high school students. So in his off time, the little he's had, he's worked a lot and put in a lot of hours with National History Day, and has really brought our students that have worked with that program a far way, and they've done very well with that program up to the national level. So I have enjoyed working with William now for probably going on 8 years, and we work very well together, I think. He is a native Kentuckian and received his undergraduate degree and master's from the University of Louisville. But we've adopted him here, and I think he's adopted Tennessee during the time that he's been here with his wife Heather and their 2 children, and many of y'all saw them up front earlier. And so we're just really glad, and we're so glad that family's able to be here with him today. And I think you will enjoy his comments. This is something he's been excited about doing for quite a while, actually since the film came out. So, Dr. William E. Hardy.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I hope everyone will pardon me today. I'm a little bit under the weather, but I've got this thing mic'd up, so I should be able to be heard, hopefully very well, and hopefully I'll hold my voice throughout. This is something we were excited to do. We tried this last year when we had a Lincoln traveling exhibit from the United States Constitution Center, and it was a hit. I mean, it turned out we didn't expect the crowd we would have, so we definitely wanted to do this again. And I was eyeing Lincoln and eyeing the opportunity once this film came out, and to coincide with our Sword and Pen pivotal moments in Civil War East Tennessee, the temporary exhibit that we have back here in our museum, which is a fascinating exhibit, which brings together through various museums and special collection archives throughout this state some of the most critical documents in our state's history during that critical time during the Civil War. I will begin today with a brief discussion of the film's plot, place the film in its historical context, discuss Spielberg's Lincoln as a contribution to history, while also highlighting shortcomings of the film from a historical viewpoint in light of recent scholarship. Finally, I will close with my own comments on Lincoln as the great emancipator. And it's my intention to do so in 25 minutes so we can get to the real big show, the film itself. And again, we'll stop 5 minutes. I'll take that camera that's in some of your all's way right now that's recording this talk down. We'll switch over the technology. That'll be a good time to get a restroom break. And then we'll start the film, which is a little bit under 2 hours and a half, okay? So considering time, I'm gathering that we'll probably be done a little after 5:10, 5:05 this evening. And if you would like to discuss the movie with me afterwards, I'll be happy to do so. The combination of Steven Spielberg's award-winning film Lincoln and the recent 150th commemoration of the Battle of Gettysburg have brought a much-needed boost in interest in the Civil War. Whether that interest will continue or not, only time will tell. Although the organizers of the Gettysburg commemoration reportedly drew an estimated 235,000 spectators over the course of their 10-day event, it is probably a safe bet that Spielberg's film will have the most important and far-reaching influence on the general public's consciousness of the Civil War than all the events that will be held during the 5-year Civil War sesquicentennial. Despite a limited release when compared to the typical blockbuster Hollywood film, Spielberg's Lincoln was an unexpected commercial success, earning a surprising $275 million worldwide. Following the release of the film on DVD and Blu-ray, which was also was #1 in its first week of release, social studies teachers across the country engaged in a letter-writing campaign that convinced Spielberg and Disney Educational Productions to donate films to approximately 37,100 schools across this country. By choosing to make a film about President Lincoln, a film that has and continues to be viewed by a much larger proportion of the population than will read any history book on Abraham Lincoln, Steven Spielberg has in fact interjected himself into the field of history. By creating his vision of Lincoln on the big screen, he has become Steven Spielberg historian. Now that fact does not set well with many professional historians who are stakeholders in anything that attempts to tell a story about the past. Now the vast majority of these movies pass us innocently enough. Although we may gripe and yell at the screen, you can ask my wife about that. But when the most popular Hollywood director decides to make a movie about Lincoln, we watch and we listen closely. We don't just watch, we also feel a strong need to point out every interpretive shortcoming of the film. Now, Spielberg's Lincoln has certainly opened up the floodgates for Lincoln scholars and Civil War historians by providing a forum to engage the public as television, newspapers, websites, and more have come calling on us to review the film and to answer that one pressing question: is it historically accurate? And thus the trap is laid for the historian, because we cannot resist the temptation when asked, is it historically accurate? We feel obligated to educate the general public and point out again every single shortcoming. And the answer the public receives typically reinforces any number of negative impressions of professional historians as party poopers, nitpickers. Now, I am no film critic, and thus I will not engage in a discussion of the film as a piece of art. I will, however, engage the film as a piece of history. Spielberg's film focuses on the last 4 months of the Lincoln presidency, and more specifically on the legislative battle in the United States House of Representatives over the passage of the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery. Lincoln clings to his high ideals, namely to emancipate the nation's 4 million enslaved African Americans. Yet, he is not afraid to dirty his hands by perhaps using temptations and the influence of the office of the presidency to engage in behind-the-scenes wheeling and dealing with lobbyists and lame duck Democrats to swing the opposition to the amendment. And one central question hovers over the entire film. And that is, if the 13th Amendment fails, what will be the legal status of Southern slaves once the war ends? As historians are supposed to do, I'm going to offer some historical context, some understanding of the events surrounding the 13th Amendment. But before I do that, I'm going to stray from the historical evidence of the 19th century that I often employ and to rely on 21st century evidence from TV and online interviews to offer some context behind Steven Spielberg and how he came to create a major motion picture based on Lincoln and his struggle to see the 13th Amendment passed in the House, an institution which, interestingly, does not often feature in Hollywood filmmaking as protagonist. Now, it was at the age of 6 that Steven Spielberg's family took him for the first time to Washington, D.C. It was during this trip, as he recalls, he came face to face for the first time with Lincoln at the Lincoln Memorial. He recalled being terrified as he mounted the steps walking up to the memorial and came upon the massive 19-foot seated Lincoln statue. He could not initially force himself to look up beyond the hands because he was terrified. But before his parents led him out of the memorial, he finally dared himself to take a peek at Lincoln's face, and he describes that a warmth overcame him, that he realized this monument before him wasn't so scary after all. That visit informed a lifelong interest in Lincoln the man rather than the monument, and subsequently he read extracurricularly widely on Lincoln and the American Civil War. The Civil War rivaled his other interest, World War II, and hence his film Saving Private Ryan. He long wanted to make a film about Lincoln, but he could neither find the right script nor the right Lincoln. In the meantime, other film projects continued to push Lincoln aside. Then in 1999, Spielberg, in a chance meeting, came across Doris Kearns Goodwin, and in a conversation, she mentioned she was writing a book about Lincoln. He immediately asked for the film rights, long before she ever finished that book. He quickly, once the book published, he tasked screenwriter Tony Kushner with massaging a script from that 750-page book that Goodwin produced. Now, from the beginning, Spielberg expressed that he was not interested in Civil War battles, but in Lincoln and his political genius that served as the main thesis of Goodwin's book. After reading numerous drafts written by Kushner, who had himself researched widely into the Civil War and Reconstruction, Spielberg focused in on the struggle to pass the 13th Amendment in the House, which interestingly only constitutes 3 pages in Goodwin's book. What captured Spielberg's interest in the 13th Amendment? He was shocked to learn that the Emancipation Proclamation was but a tenuous war measure, a proclamation that Lincoln issued under his powers as Commander-in-Chief. Spielberg had been raised like many Americans before him, thinking that the proclamation freed all the slaves in the South, and that it was the greatest work that Lincoln ever did in his career and his life. But now, after reading screenwriter Kushner's script, which told of a struggle to pass the 13th Amendment, to solidify Lincoln's promise of freedom to the slaves as outlined in the proclamation, Spielberg was haunted by one question. If the 13th Amendment failed, would the proclamation have been thrown out at the end of the war, and thus the slaves freed by Lincoln's proclamation returned to their former masters? He found within that story a powerful drama that he could tell, the one lasting, permanent, constitutional amendment that would unequivocally end slavery for all. The film Spielberg intended to make was one in which Lincoln achieved his destiny as the great emancipator in passing the 13th Amendment. It is a film in which Lincoln, like no president before him, injected himself into the political process by using the office of the presidency to successfully turn the opposition to pass the amendment. In its actuality, according to Spielberg, the historian, the 13th Amendment, not the Emancipation Proclamation, that's what is in effect the most lasting achievement of Lincoln's political career, and his career as a compassionate, deeply thoughtful, and mindful human being. It is Spielberg's decision to focus on that and depict Lincoln as the puppeteer, so to speak, engineering the 13th Amendment's passage, in which Spielberg finds his own voice among Lincoln lore. While historians have long acknowledged Lincoln's role in the 13th Amendment, no one has gone as far as Spielberg in putting Lincoln so much at the center of the storm. It is doubtful that historians will ever be able to write on Lincoln again in the 13th Amendment without referencing Spielberg and his film. According to Spielberg, what Lincoln achieved with the 13th Amendment was absolutely causal for the future of African Americans, which leads to one major criticism from historians. Namely, the film projects the image of Lincoln as the great emancipator of the slaves, and that he was the man who pulled the strings in order to get the 13th Amendment passed. A close viewing of the film would indicate that that is not entirely a fair criticism. Spielberg does show the radical Republicans in Congress, in the House, are instrumental in shepherding the 13th Amendment through. But a fair question to ask is, where are the prominent black voices in this film? While Spielberg contends that his film does include powerful black voices, the film does give the impression that blacks are simply sitting idly by for white political leaders, such as Lincoln, to bestow freedom upon their race. Historians will argue that without proper historical context, one might come to the conclusion after watching this film that Abraham Lincoln led this nation on the issue of emancipation. Well, that is simply not the case. Where others led, Lincoln followed on the issue of emancipation. Since the modern civil rights movement, historians have demonstrated that slaves themselves pressed the issue of emancipation to the forefront of the political agenda. The Civil War might have started out as a war to preserve the Union, but the moment slaves began to run away from their masters and flee into the Union lines, their status as contraband of war became a legal dilemma for the United States government. In two cases early in the war, Union commanders pushed Lincoln to take a stand on slavery when they freed slaves that had entered their lines, declaring martial law. The first occurred in August 1861 in Missouri under General John C. Fremont's command, and again in May 1862 in the coastal regions of Florida, Georgia, and mostly South Carolina under General David Hunter's command. In both cases, Lincoln reprimanded his generals, instructing them to send back any slaves that had entered their lines to their masters. Hardly the actions of a great emancipator. But Lincoln was merely reaffirming the Republican Party's stance on the issue of slavery at this point in the war, that it was protected by the Constitution and that they had no intention of abolishing slavery where it existed. As the war began to drag on, Republican congressmen, led by a radical Republican minority that you'll see in this movie, that favored abolition, also began pushing Lincoln on the issue of slavery by passing a D.C. Emancipation Bill, which freed all the slaves in Washington, D.C., and two confiscation acts, which sought to target the slaves of disloyal Southern masters. Though the confiscation acts were largely ineffective on several levels, including their vague language, which did not necessarily deal with the issue of emancipation, congressional action revealed a growing Republican consensus to take more decisive action involving Southern slaves as the war progressed. Last but not least, the abolitionists themselves had long been out in the forefront of advocating the abolition of slavery. Prominent white and black leaders had long pressed Lincoln to take decisive action on emancipation. Foremost among them, Frederick Douglass, who offered harsh criticism of Lincoln's administration's failure to lead on emancipation in 1862. Quote, "Abraham Lincoln is ashamed to tell the world what he is fighting against. We are fighting the rebels with only one hand when we ought to be fighting them with both. We are striking the guilty rebels with our soft white hand when we should be striking them with the iron hand of the black man, which we keep chained behind us. We have been catching slaves instead of arming them. We have thus far repelled our natural friends to win the worthless and faithless friendship of our unnatural enemies. We have been endeavoring to heal over the rotten cancer of slavery instead of cutting out its death-dealing roots and fibers. We pay more attention to the advice of the half-rebel state of Kentucky than to any suggestion coming from the North. We have shouldered all the burdens. We have shouldered all the burdens of slavery and given the slaveholders and traders all its benefits and robbed our cause of half of its dignity in the eyes of an onlooking world. If this nation is destroyed, it will be solely owing to the want of moral courage and wise statesmanship in dealing with slavery, the cause and motive of the rebellion. It is interesting that shortly after Douglass uttered these words, Lincoln began finally to move toward issuing his Emancipation Proclamation. Perhaps Douglass swayed Lincoln somewhat because when Lincoln finally issued his Emancipation Proclamation, he did in fact open up the possibility towards arming black soldiers in the Union Army. It's a portion of the Emancipation Proclamation that has long been overlooked. But the Emancipation Proclamation does bear out Douglass's warning that Lincoln paid more attention to that half-rebel state of Kentucky than the loyal North. A close reading of the Emancipation Proclamation reveals that Lincoln, in 1862, even on January 1st, 1863, when the proclamation went into effect, was continuing to pursue a border state strategy, even as he announced emancipation as a Union war goal. It was a proclamation designed both to threaten the Confederacy to lay down their arms or else they'll forfeit their slaves, as well as to appease border state slave owners whose slaves were exempted under Lincoln's proclamation. First, only the slaves behind Confederate lines as of January 1st, 1863 were free. Second, the loyal border states of Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware were also exempted from the emancipation as a reward for their loyalty to the Union, and because they had not seceded, then their slave property was still protected under the Constitution. Third, Tennessee, a state that had actually seceded from the Union, was exempted from the proclamation. Why was Tennessee exempted, a state that seceded? Well, because of East Tennessee's Andrew Johnson. Johnson, like a few others leading Southern Unionists, were ordered by Lincoln to return to their respective states once the war had begun, to restore a loyal government as part of Lincoln's Reconstruction policy. Johnson convinced Lincoln that many loyal East Tennesseans were lukewarm to the idea of emancipation. He informed Lincoln that East Tennesseans had been told that the war was being fought to preserve the Union, not to abolish slavery. Lincoln initially believed that the majority of Southerners were faithful to the Union and had been only coerced into the Confederacy by fire-eating politicians who had misrepresented his policy for their own political ends. However, by 1863, Lincoln had finally come to the realization that his belief in a Southern Unionist majority was a myth. It simply did not exist. Therefore, when he issued his Emancipation Proclamation, he did so knowing that he could not risk losing the border states and Tennessee by applying the proclamation in these states. Last, but most importantly, before you view the Spielberg's film, is one fact above all limiting the enforcement power of the proclamation, and that is that the proclamation was a temporary war measure under Lincoln's powers as Commander-in-Chief. Many wondered at the time what would be the legal status of those emancipated slaves once the war ended, once Lincoln was no longer Commander-in-Chief. Would a proclamation issued in wartime be legally binding in peacetime? So if Lincoln was following rather than leading on the issue of emancipation, when, if ever, did Lincoln turn and begin to, in fact, lead on the issue? The answer, not until after his re-election in 1864. While he remained focused on the war, it's at this point, following his re-election, he began to think like many second-term presidents. What would define his presidency? What would be his legacy? Now, no president since Andrew Jackson had ever been re-elected. And with a strong mandate that he had received in 1860 as he saw it, Lincoln was freer to shape his administration than he had been previously. He now turned to bind up the nation's wounds, to rid the country of slavery, to put an end to the question of whether his proclamation would be legally binding once the war ended. It's at this point in January 1865 that Spielberg's film picks up. It traces the moment in which Lincoln took decisive action to lead as he urged the passage of the amendment to abolish slavery, which he had previously failed to do so before the election. Lincoln now maintained that the presidential election had served as a referendum on the amendment because it had been the first election since he had issued his Emancipation Proclamation, and that the majority of the voters had spoken and they were in favor of emancipation. In addition to urging Congress to pass the amendment, he dispatched William Seward, his Secretary of State, to lead a major lobbying effort to win its approval. Republicans would reliably vote in favor of the amendment, but to gain a two-thirds majority to pass the amendment, several Democratic and border state representatives, almost all of whom had opposed the amendment, would have to change their votes. Fierce executive pressure brought enough around, and it is likely, as shown in the film, that Lincoln cut political deals to gain the needed votes to pass the amendment. What is certain is that Lincoln intervened more directly in the legislative process in this matter than he had ever done during his presidency. It is again Lincoln's political genius in leading the passage of the 13th Amendment that Spielberg latches onto in order to depict Lincoln as fitting of the great emancipator status. In this, I would argue that Steven Spielberg exaggerates the president's role in leading the struggle to pass the 13th Amendment. While Lincoln was a political genius, while he certainly stepped up to the plate and took decisive action in steering the final votes needed to pass the amendment, Lincoln was still part of a collective process. For the emancipation of the slaves was a long and complicated historical process. It's not the work of one man, no matter how great it was. It was not Lincoln who originated the 13th Amendment. It was the slaves themselves and the abolitionist movement. It's only after Lincoln's re-election in 1864 that he changed his mind, and he decides that now he's in favor of the amendment. I do agree with Spielberg's argument that there was a sense of urgency on the part of Lincoln to pass the amendment before the war ended. I agree that he was willing to forestall the potential of peace talks with Confederate commissioners because if the war ceased before the amendment passed, there was the potential that slavery could remain intact in the border states, possibly throughout the South. In this, I disagree with Eric Foner, one of the most prominent American historians, and who has written a Pulitzer Prize book on Lincoln and slavery. Foner argues that there was no urgent need to pass the amendment, that emancipation was a fact, and that it would have eventually passed in the next Congress, one that was poised to be more Republican. Well, it was true the next Congress was going to be more Republican. Foner's argument relies on factors that quote, would have materialized, which we do not know because that's counterfactual history, and it discounts the uncertainty and urgency that permeated the American Civil War and the people who lived during these momentous times. Keep in mind as you watch the film, the sense of uncertainty about the future and the urgency to enact revolutionary reforms because of that uncertainty. Is Spielberg's film historically accurate? For the most part, it's historically accurate. Spielberg and screenwriter Tony Kushner did their own homework. They've read widely. Historians can tell. They've done their homework. They've dug into the vast literature of Lincoln, and they've dug into the primary sources and the quotes that have been recorded. Do they take license throughout the film? Yeah. There are points that they have changed the names of congressmen, that they cannot say for sure whether they're involved in the shady deal. There are dubious quotes that you will hear Daniel Day-Lewis utter as Lincoln, which are ridiculous. African Americans are left out as major players in their own emancipation, which disappoints professional historians after more than 50 years of research. But it is really a good film, that it's well made. If the film sparks an interest in Americans to study the Civil War, to study their own nation's history, then that's not a bad thing at all. My advice for the historical film is to watch it and then pick up a good book, or 2, or 3. I want to close with my own comments about Lincoln, the Great Emancipator. Spielberg's film clearly emancipates Lincoln from the constant barrage of attacks that he's been under since the 1950s and 60s. That referred to him as a racist. They've gone back and quotes that, yes, in our viewpoint today, they're racist. But if I violate my own rule not to criticize the filmmakers for not making the film that I would have wanted to see, which no one would pay to go see anyway, I would like to have seen a film that accurately captures Lincoln's personal growth throughout the Civil War. We can see the dramatic transformation in Lincoln's physical appearance during the Civil War. He comes into the presidency as a much youthful 52-year-old man, and when he exits, he looks like a really worn-out, tired 56-year-old man whose presidency was tragically cut short. He underwent a significant change in his racial views, which I think is fitting of the title The Great Emancipator. He began his presidency conservative in his political views, but as the war dragged on, he came into contact with people he had never come in contact with. He listened to their stories, listened to their problems, and his views changed. He followed rather than led on the issue of emancipation for much of his presidency. But in the last 4 months of his life, he changed course and began to lead. Though he did not initiate the 13th Amendment, he contributed to its success, and he should be credited for that. It is in fact in his last public speech, given on April 11, 1865, 3 days before his assassination, that he led in the realm of racial equality. It was in that speech, delivered to a crowd that had assembled on the White House lawn to serenade him. It was 2 days after Robert E. Lee's surrender to Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse, and the people of Washington were happy and ready to celebrate. And they descended on the White House. They'd actually descended the night before, but Lincoln wasn't prepared. He was overwhelmed. He knew they wanted, what was his vision of the future? What would be his policy in the South? But he wasn't prepared. He knew they'd be back on April 11th, and this time he was prepared to give a speech. A little bit of his vision of the future. And it was in that speech that he uttered the very words that led to his death. He was looking to the future, and he acknowledged that Reconstruction, this post-war period, was fraught with great difficulty. But he was prepared, he said, now, to give the ballot to intelligent blacks and to those African Americans who had fought for their country in the Union Army. That was Lincoln pushing far beyond the boundaries of freedom guaranteed in the 13th Amendment. That was Lincoln pushing far beyond the boundaries of black civil and political rights, far beyond what anyone else, but perhaps the radical Republicans at that time, were prepared to do. That was Lincoln leading rather than following in the realm of racial politics. That is the story I tell my students in the course of my semester at Lincoln Memorial University when I teach the course on Lincoln's life and legacy. It's a story of personal growth, And it's really a story in which Lincoln is emancipated himself. It's why I believe Lincoln was the great emancipator. Not for the proclamation, but for that growth and where he was taking the country. He outlined a policy that Republicans would struggle to enact, and we as Americans would take 100 years and still to this day struggle to enact, to realize Lincoln's vision for modern America. It's that vision for the post-Civil War America that ultimately cost his life, because that evening when he gave that speech in that crowd was an actor named John Wilkes Booth, and he did not share Lincoln's vision. And at that time he decided that then and there he would murder the president rather than kidnap him, which was the subject of last year's talk. I leave you with those wonderful thoughts, because that's where Spielberg will lead you in this film, and I hope you have the same reaction that I have when I watch that film. And I give it away, just a spoiler, that he walks away heading towards, you know where he's going. Thank you very much. We'll take a 5-minute break. I'll take down that camera set up, and we'll prepare for